Everyone's brain is amazing. We have almost 100 billion neurons connecting to other neurons, transmitting electrical and neurochemical messages along familiar pathways, and constantly forging new pathways when these old pathways are challenged. Adapting, changing, evolving. Yes, that is your brain. It's my brain too, and it's my good friend Graham's brain also. Every brain is unique, but every human brain is quite similar too. It's the connection pathways that differentiate us. My brain is very unique, and my friend Graham's brain is also very unique. My friend Graham has an autism spectrum condition, and he has neural pathways that may differ marginally or quite markedly from what is considered within the range of normal. I've had the pleasure of walking alongside and conducting extensive research with so many like Graham. We know that the brain controls most of behaviour. In fact, it's a locus of decision making. Whether these decisions are fast or well thought out, emotionally driven, which I know I've made one or two of these in my time, or rationalised and methodical. Besides reflex behaviour, most of our behaviour is a decision. Great. Well, how do we make decisions? Our decisions are most commonly products of our environments. To quote Newton, for every action, there is an equal or opposite reaction. Let me step this out and give you a simple example. Okay, so I want you to imagine you're in the car getting a lift from someone. Maybe it's a new work colleague and you're trying to be polite, but then they turn the music up way too loud. What do? How do you cope? Your environment is uncomfortable, maybe a little bit overwhelming. So what's your decision? Do you endure it because you're 10 minutes from your destination and you don't want to offend this kind person that's given you a lift? Or do you politely ask them to turn it down because it's slightly hurting your ears, but then run the risk of them being taken aback or think you're ungrateful for the ride to the destination? Whichever decision you make internally, it's your behaviour that outplays it externally. Let's see what's going on here for you. Now we're going to focus only on the sensory auditory aspect, although please keep in mind there's visual, movement, vestibular and tactile sensory input that's coming in. Okay, so when you hear something, there are two major pathways that sound travels through for your brain to reach an understanding of the irrelevance or importance of that sound. The first is the primary auditory pathway, which carries messages exclusively from the cochlea. The second is the sensory reticular pathway, which, as you've probably guessed, carries all types of sensory messages. The primary auditory pathway, it's quite short. It carries messages from the cochlear nuclei, containing information about the frequency, intensity and duration of sound, to the superior olivary complex. From there, the message is delivered to the superior colliculus, which plays a role in the localization of sound. The message is then delivered to the medial janculate body, which helps establish your motor responses to that sound, so your vocal responses. Lastly, the message ends up in the primary auditory cortex, where a decision is made to respond to that sound. And that is just the primary pathway. The non-primary pathways are incredibly valuable also. They enable us to mediate sensory responses via the reticular pathway of the brainstem and the mesencephalus. This is so we can filter out irrelevant sounds, which is very important when we're sleeping or maybe conducting some work in a cafe somewhere. But it's the integrity of these two pathways that allow us to consciously perceive sounds. But are there differences in this pathway for my friend Graham? Recent studies concerning the auditory processing of individuals on the spectrum found differences in the latency and amplitude of processing between typically developing individuals and individuals with ASD in relation to speech and pitch sounds. When considering event-related potentials in the brain, those with ASD show both increased and decreased processing speed, which makes sense when you consider the hypo and hypersensitive sensory profiles of many individuals on the spectrum. early in the processing stream, way back in the cochlea, it is apparent those with ASD differ from typically developing individuals. So, I want you to imagine not being able to endure the sound of the loud music, but not having the social skills to be able to articulate or communicate through any other means that your colleague needs to turn the music down. And what if that small space with the unfamiliar other and blaringly loud music was impairing any of your ability to make a rational decision? What would you do? Imagine trying to encode, localize, respond to, and filter sounds when that isn't the way your brain automatically responds to sound. You'd feel a little stressed, right? After all, no one else seems to have an issue with this. This is just a theoretical example of what it might be to step into the oftentimes exhausting life of an individual on the spectrum, and they do whatever they can to cope. Most often, coping manifests in the symptom domain of rigid and repetitive behaviours, in which the individual finds consistency, familiarity, and safety. This could look like twirling, flicking fingers, lining up toy cars, or engaging in a long one-sided conversation about the molecular structure of glass. And trust me, I've been a part of one of those conversations. These are what are known as low-level coping behaviours. Now, the general public may recognise them as odd or slightly strange, but harmless behaviours. But I say they've missed the point. What is the point then? The point is, behaviour is a language. We all speak unique behaviour language, one we have both learned and inherited. Within that language, we have a unique dialect which may vary on context. For example, in my home environment, I may speak a particular behaviour language dialect that I share with my family members, but that dialect may differ in a friendship context. So, every individual with ASD may have a unique behaviour dialect, but that is often misunderstood by everyday people like you and I. So imagine, like my friend Graham, you speak a particular behaviour language, but that's always misunderstood by your friends, by your family, and by the general public. And what can we do then? I say, acknowledge behaviour as a communication method. Before you judge someone from their overt behaviour, ask yourself, what is this behaviour trying to say? What is it trying to communicate? And from there, you can begin to connect the dots. What preceded this behaviour to set it up? What does the behaviour itself look like? What were the consequences to the behaviour that could possibly be feeding it? And ultimately, what was the purpose of the behaviour? The behaviour's purpose is called its function. And once you've figured this out, you're in the ballpark of their behaviour language. Understanding anyone's behaviour language is an important and powerful tool to have in building up great social skills and making meaningful connections. But let me show you and tell you why it's so important to make a meaningful connection with someone like Graham. He struggled at school, so his mother homeschools him because the bullying from other children became too intense. Unfortunately, this is all too common. On the Gold Coast, 81.3% of children and adolescents with an ASD reported experiencing bullying at school. Worse yet, 41.7% of these same individuals reported they experienced bullying daily by multiple groups of people. And this is all too common. But wait a minute, I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second. These are boys who have trouble interpreting social situations. How do we actually know what they're experiencing as bullying? Easy. You ask them what bullying is. And that's what these Gold Coast researchers have done. They asked the boys directly about what they thought constituted bullying. As you can see in this table here, their responses show that they actually know what they're experiencing as bullying. It looks and sounds like to me that these boys know exactly what is going on. And this is hard to digest for some. I know it was for me. The research went further in depth and investigated the ramifications of this bullying. Most of the boys reported trying to keep their emotions inside until they got home, resulting in completely withdrawing or oftentimes melting down. And this is quite common. I've spoken to numerous parents whose child has a meltdown straight after they finish school, either in the car or at home. But what can we do? How could connection make a difference? Well, I suggest two avenues, both person-to-person connection and neural pathway to neural pathway connection. Both I am familiar with, and both I seek to marry together as a researcher and clinician. The person-to-person connection is simple. Seek to understand their behaviour language. Start to become multilingual with the behaviour languages of people around you. Seek to find out who they are, what their sensitivities are. For instance, if I wish to connect with someone like Graham, and I know he's sensitive to fluorescent lighting, I'll engage him in connection in a room with alternative lighting. Small changes like that are so simple to make, yet so profound for the individual. But what if you're already making an effort to connect? What if you're seeking them out? Then that's amazing. Well done, keep up the incredible work. The world needs more people like you. But what about the individual with ASD? Isn't there evidence to suggest there are aberrances in the ASD brain when compared to typically developing individuals? Yes, there are. Quite a lot, actually. And I've compiled just a fraction for you in this table here. Well, I mean, that's just a little overwhelming. I mean, I guess the brain won. I should just go home. It looks like there's going to be resounding issues with socialization, communication, and rigidity all their lives because we know that the brain doesn't change. Wrong. We now know that this is incorrect. The brain is plastic. It is dynamic. It responds to the environment and even moderates the expression of genes. This is known as neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. But what? Wait, how can this happen? And more importantly, what can we do to kick off this process? There are lots of ways. Learning, for example, creates new neural pathways that challenge old ones and strengthens new areas of the brain. But every individual learns in a different way. And every individual has a unique brain with unique strengths and weaknesses. So that could be a bit of a roundabout way of going about it. That's why I prefer to go straight to the source. If it's a neural issue, let the individual look at their brainwaves and change those connections themselves. But how is that possible? I'm glad you asked. That's the beauty of neurofeedback training, transdirect current stimulation, infralow frequency training, and other brain training tools. We can use electroencephalography to create a unique profile of the individual's brain, pinpoint areas of strengths and weaknesses, work on changing and shaping pre-existing connections, and developing and molding entirely new connections. And this is not just the future, this is now. Although it's relatively new, in the last 2 to 3 years, a breadth of research has been conducted concerning the efficacy of brain training tools. And the results, although they're in their infancy, are quite promising. This is amazing because individuals who previously struggled with crippling social anxiety and out of control rigidity of behaviour are beginning to forge meaningful connections. Firstly, because everyday people like you and I are seeking to understand their behaviour language. And secondly, because neurotraining is becoming increasingly recognised and therefore available to those who would really benefit from it. So what to take out of this talk today? Connect for connection. Thank you.